move us along now to the next segment of our agenda. We have two relatively short presentations lined up. The first from Monty Williams and Chuck Rhodes, speaking to the climate outlook and trends for the forest. And again, Mark Anderson at the Nature Conservancy will speak to the TNC Resilient and Connected Landscapes tool. Both of these, we could have asked them to speak for an hour each easily. And so we appreciate them agreeing to actually condense, so much of their knowledge into the short time we offered. So about 20 minutes each on presentation, and then leaving some time, about 10 minutes each for Q&A is the plan, and we'll take Q&A after each one. So let me turn it, I think, first to Monty, who's going to give a couple high-level remarks, and then Chuck, I think you can work with Jonathan in the meantime to be ready to share your screen. Thank you again to all the presenters who agreed to be with us today. So Monty, turning it to you.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine, thanks.
Great. So I'm actually sitting in Tennessee in my in-laws' garage. So this is my temporary office as we're out visiting my 84-year-old in-laws. I'm not going to talk much. The person you really want to hear from is Chuck, and so I'm going to hand it over to him fairly quickly. But I want to kind of set the stage maybe for Chuck from a management standpoint and the way I think about it. When I think about the Rocky Mountains and go in there to recreate, it's the forest that's the medium, that we're recreating in. And so having that forest sitting on that landscape, I think is absolutely critical. We certainly have, some of you may have recreated in some of the places that have burnt, either here on this forest or others, and it's a very different environment. We're sitting now 13 years or whatever, it's been a hunk of time since Hyde Park burned, and there's still not a lot of trees, and that environment, it does not provide necessarily the same recreational opportunities that the rest of the forested environment does. And so I'm going to argue that forested environment is really important to the recreational setting, as it were, that we provide and offer for ourselves and our guests. I want to use an analogy really quick that I've used to frame up kind of my perspective in fire. I kind of imagine a mechanic talking with a customer, and that customer is really concerned that the lights are flickering on the car that they've brought in for the mechanic to take a look at. And the mechanic looks over the car and goes, holy smokes, the engine and the transmission are about ready to fail. This car is about ready just to die out in the middle of the road. And as they go back and talk to the customer says, oh yeah, but it's the lights. I really want you to fix these lights. And I think a lot of times our discussions around forest and the issues that we are facing with that are kind of like that discussion. We all have our own lights that we're really concerned about. But we just kind of go, yeah, fire and wildfire, and yeah, I get that, but let's look at my lights. And I think we've got to look at that engine and transmission when we're thinking about recreation. When I started the Forest Service a long time ago, a big fire was 4,000 acres. And it wasn't long after that those fires were now 100,000 acres or better. And now we've seen monster fires, of course, across this landscape, and things that I would have never imagined at that time. I remember a stream, and I'm a hydrologist by training and practiced as a hydrologist for a number of years. So a stream I knew very well that I used to be able to jump over, that after a fire was 20 foot deep and 60 foot wide. And we were lucky to have a research station nearby, Forest Service research station, and some scientists there that specialize in watersheds and such came out and looked at this event. And they said the material in the bottom of that channel that this flood had cut through had been deposited 10,000 years ago. And it implied that whatever had happened, this was a 10,000 year event because stuff had been depositing there for that long. And here it took this event that time to go, or in that one event, it cut through all of that sediment. And what I'm getting at is that we're starting to see these fires as something that's an anomaly, or something that's a little different. And they certainly have some pretty huge effects. I think as I've watched forest after forest that supposedly was an asbestos forest that never burns, all of a sudden start to burn. And then when they do, they burn a lot. It furthers that belief in my mind that we're seeing something that's changing. And I'm not going to go into all the details on this, but Mark Finney, a research scientist who works for the Forest Service Missoula lab, it's a fire lab for the Forest Service. He did a presentation a few years ago for the Colorado governor, and he said a couple of things. He said right now the forests in Colorado are already in a fire management regime. It just happens to be one that it's not one that we're managing or making choices on. It's doing it itself. You know, Hayman, High Park are two examples. Now we got Grizzly, Williams Fork, Cameron Peak. Nature is already, if we're not going to manage fire, what his argument was nature is going to go manage that forest, and it's doing that right now. He estimated by 2050, so NoCo 2050, that we would have a third to a half of our forest, the ARP, in a burn condition. And I say that while we're sitting here watching Cameron and Williams Fork still remain active at a time of the year that they should have long been put out and not moving a bit. And so a third to a half of our forest where it's burnt and there's no trees left by 2050 potentially. And so that's a big deal. He did a back of the envelope calculation and said, you know, we should be burning about 70,000 acres a year on both public and private. So both, it got to burn on both to be able to avoid the wildfire doing that for us instead, and doing that in a more severe way. So tying this back to NoCo, I feel that wildfire, and I felt this way prior to my Cameron and Williams Forks fires, it's the greatest threat to recreation in the area. And if we're interested in recreation, then we have to be interested in what we can do to help change this pattern of wildfire behavior out on the landscape, or the whole medium in which we recreate is going to be very different. And I'm not sure that we want it that different. And so this implies this group, I think, has to be engaged and be supportive and think about the things that we need to do to change that condition out there, that wildfire doesn't do what it's doing right now. And I guess what I'm saying is I'd rather have you kind of look at the transmission and the engine and not worry so much about the lights right now, because I think that's our issue. If we're going to keep that car going down the road, we better get those two fixed. We'll get the lights figured out later. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chuck. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monty. And as we get Chuck's slides up on the screen, just another plug as well. For the presentation, Tom Veblen also prepared for us that you can link through the lit review, which speaks a little bit, Monty, to the changes in seeing reestablishment of forests after fire. I'm guessing Chuck will cover those trends with us a bit too here. So really looking forward to this presentation. I see your slides, Chuck, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. So you see my slide, you hear me?
Yes, all is coming through clearly.
It's kind of weird because I'm looking at one screen and my slides are on another one. So hopefully I won't, don't feel bad if I don't look at you. Okay.
You know
so
how that goes. I'm guilty of that all the time.
Thanks very much for this invitation. This is a great meeting so far. And I think Corinne gave my talk already, so I could probably just zip through these slides really fast and just provide some sort of graphical backgrounds to what she talked about. We're all kind of living in the same situation, so it's not a big surprise that we have a lot of common research and a lot of common interests. I hope you guys are doing well. My summer's been pretty crazy. I've been smelling a lot of smoke and dealing with masks and dealing with where I can go and where I can't go. What I'd like to do today is kind of give you a bit of a 30,000-foot overview of a couple of the main climate change responders that really kind of resonate with Colorado forests, and then sort of how those two things T-boned this summer and have affected kind of what we're seeing around the state. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about, and you know, this is one of these things that many of you have embedded in your whole upbringing. You've seen changes, and if you've lived in Colorado for a couple decades, you've probably come to know bark beetles. Maybe as kids in Colorado, they came through in the 70s and had an outbreak in Summit County in the early 80s. It's a native beetle. It influences forests. But sometime in the late 90s, the beetles sort of found a new gear, and they went kind of coast to coast throughout Colorado and also throughout the Western US. And it really sort of became kind of a poster child for how climate change influences forests. One of the things I'd like to just to kind of point to is 2002, which was the date that the beetle outbreak in Colorado really sort of took off. There was an increase in activity in the early 90s, but the droughts in 2002 were when things really started going. You can see in the upper graph the lodgepole pine, the acreage go up at that point. There had been long-term trends. You see the graph in the lower left of increasing temperatures and the minimum temperatures that keep beetles in check. That had gone up, but it was sort of the drought kind of overriding or overlapping with the temperature changes and probably some other things like stand conditions. And so we went coast to coast in Colorado, wall to wall, and the peak was about 2008 at the Fraser Experimental Forest near Winter Park, where I do a lot of work. We saw the first bugs in 2003. By about 2006, it was pretty much the red wave had passed. So you see the figure in the upper left-hand corner showing that within a couple years, you go from green forests to red forests, and then following that, you're into a gray phase, like you can see in the lower right hand. And many of the stands in Colorado have 60 to 90% dead overstory. The map in the upper right-hand corner, I'm sure many of you have seen. It was all over the front pages of newspapers throughout the early 2000s. And take a look at that and remember that pattern, and you're going to see that again in a little while. Basically, you guys are interested in things north of I-70. Well, this beetle outbreak pretty much killed all the lodgepole pine stands north of I-70. That beetle outbreak kind of stimulated a whole lot of management, and that was a pretty exciting time. There were more harvesting happened. Say on the graph on the left is the Sulphur Ranger District, one of the districts that Monty oversees. They started a pretty aggressive salvage operation and harvested more than they had since the 1970s. So a lot of activity was going on. However, they really only touched a small amount of the landscape. A lot of the landscape out there is on steep slopes, it's in wilderness, roadless, and so there are a lot of limits on what can really happen. So even though there was great social license for the first time since the 70s, it was really hard to get a lot of work done. That overlapped with the recession, the fact that we have a limited number of mills, and I think becomes one of the conversations that your group should probably address moving forward. This is definitely what Aaron would call a wicked problem, and I would agree. How do you really, even if you want to do things, how can you get stuff done, and how can you do it in a timely manner? So a couple of things. So the beetle outbreak came through, and we did a bunch of research. I've got some links at the end of the talk, and Jonathan can load those if he wants to help you guys if you want to read some of our papers. We sampled areas that had been harvested, sampled areas that had not been harvested, that had been infected by the beetle outbreak, and found that forests were recovering following the beetle outbreak. We counted little trees and projected growth going forward, and estimated that within about 100 years we'd be back about to where we were for pre-beetle conditions. So the trees were about 100 years when they got killed. They grow at this rate, and it's fairly straightforward. You're going to get back to it, and whether you harvest or not probably didn't make a whole lot of difference, but it did matter to the species composition. So a lot of the forests that were not harvested, so far, harvested forests come back as lodgepole pine. We've seen lots of even-aged lodgepole pine around Colorado that regenerated following harvesting or fires, so that's no surprise. But what we haven't seen a lot of are stands that are dominated by a lot of fir, and that may be the kind of situation that, based on our data, we would expect in a lot of the uncut forests, and that's an interesting topic from a fire perspective. Okay, so moving to the second part of this puzzle, and the one that's probably on everybody's mind. Aaron brought up the comment about increased length. I think Corinne also mentioned it. across the Western US, this has been seen 3 weeks to a month earlier in terms of things like early flows, in terms of the when the fire season has begun. Some places no longer don't have a fire season, California being one of those. Colorado, we have some great recent examples. Picture in the lower right was in Boulder County, a fire that happened in February. The Beaver Creek fire, which happened in 2016, started in the middle of June. There was still snow on the ground up around that area. This is right on the Colorado-Wyoming border, and then it burned for 100 days. Very long window of burning conditions. And as Monty mentioned, and if you've looked outside or you've looked at the weather forecast, the fires we're dealing with now don't really look like they're going to slow down. There's a little bit of weather predicted, but it seems like it's mostly going to be wind and not a lot of precipitation. So the season continues to extend. Okay, so other than smoke in your laundry, why do people care? I'm sure this group has a really great idea. Monty brought up some of the topics in terms of how it influences recreation. Everybody in this meeting understands this. This is a picture of us in a field trip a few weeks ago with the water providers that bring water out of Chambers Reservoir in the lower right and the upper right-hand corner. Those people care quite a bit because they know that our Front Range water supply depends on the health of these forests. So 2/3 of the water from Western communities, and Colorado is no exception, come from forests. So there's a direct link, and that influences not only drinking water, it influences agriculture, it influences aquatic biota, fisheries, and of course, if you're interested in recreation, it influences that as well. So fire's not all fire, and I think this is kind of an important point and this group probably knows this, but it's always good to kind of keep in mind that fires vary a lot, and it's good to be kind of informed. Not all forests are the same, not all fires are the same. And so we think a lot about fire severity, and I'm sure you've heard things about the increase in fire severity. What that means is how much of the organic layers that are protecting the soil and the vegetation have been consumed. So the more that's lost, the more that things respond. And that means that you're going to have larger downstream effects because your mineral soils have been exposed to erosion, losses of nutrients, losses of other contaminants. So this time of year, following these fires, the Forest Service BEAR team, the Burned Area Emergency Rehabilitation Crews, they're out checking out maps and trying to give as much detail as possible, because that information will help to predict what kind of downstream effects there are. So fire severity is a very important thing, and being aware that it may vary across forests, it may vary across catchments. The picture on the left hand is of the Hayman fire, and you can see some catchments burn the entire thing at high severity, other ones only a small amount, and those really influence the way they respond. So here's some data that we collected over the last 15 years at the Hayman fire, and just a few important points. Fire severity influences the water quality attributes that you see on the left. So nitrate, total dissolved nitrogen, DOC, and sediment. Those are all attributes that influence downstream, either aquatic habitat, drinking water supply, irrigation, and so on. So those are kind of important for the viability of those watersheds. They also indicate how much those watersheds have changed. So in this case, these are 14 or 15 years after the forest, and these watersheds are no longer retaining nutrients like they used to. Corinne mentioned nitrogen deposition. In these watersheds prior to the fire, over 90% of the nitrogen coming in stayed in the watersheds. After the fire, even 15 years after it, about 50% of the nutrients that come into these watersheds are being flushed downstream. That's a very, very large effect. We've seen this at Hayman, and we've also seen this in other places across the Western US. Okay, so fire and bark beetles, they're native, right? And everything in Colorado, if it's native, it must be good. Well, that used to be the case. I'm not sure. Something changed though, and the native stuff kind of freaked out a little bit. We're seeing new new responses in our watersheds, in our ecosystems from some of these disturbances that have people concerned that maybe some of the ecology 101 we learned about how forests regenerate after fire, how forests live with fire, these things may no longer be the case. The photo in the middle is the Hayman fire. If any of you have not gone and visited that burn scar, I highly recommend it. It's a greatest hits of Colorado disturbance lore. Even 15 or so years after the fire, it's 18 at this point, the forest is just barely starting to get a foothold and move back. And the predictions are that it will be a century or longer before we get back to forest. Hayman is an example, and there are other burns along the Front Range where similar patterns have seen. People who are working in Yellowstone and other locations around the West are seeing the same thing. So these are patterns, they're climate related, and as Corinne was talking about, additional stressors, that may be what's going on. And so another example of that, or a Colorado flavored example of that, is where things are T-boning, as I said before, where we have gray phase forests. These are forests that were killed by bark beetles and have been dead on the landscape for some period of time, where they have been burning. And this is kind of a new situation. We haven't seen much of it. There's been very little research on it. And so we don't really know how things will respond. The Beaver Creek fire I mentioned earlier in 2016, that was our first kind of taste of this. The fire community was very kind of cagey about putting people on the ground. It's very dangerous to put firefighters on the ground because the trees are already dead and weakened, and so they're more likely to fall down, and putting people on the ground is very, very treacherous. So the fire managers kept people back and basically didn't do a very aggressive attack on this, and it burned for, like I said, 100 days. So just in case you haven't been to the top of Jones Pass, and I love the image that Mr. Wheeler gave us. This is a view from of the Williams Fork fire. I was in there a few weeks ago on some pre-bear work, and you can see the condition of those forests. Hopefully, it's clear to you that that photo on the left, that's some of the best gray phase lodgepole pine you're going to see anywhere. It's got to be 80 to 90% overstory mortality. And it's still standing 15 years after it was killed. The picture to the right is inside of the Williams Fork burn perimeter. So you can see that's the kind of stuff that was going to burn. And on the lower left, that was a photo that I took last summer as I was going into the Sugarloaf fire, which is just around the corner, another high elevation fire. And you can see how much fuel's on the ground. So that right there should be a good indicator of what the fire effects are going to be. It's also an indicator of why managers can't put firefighters on the ground. It's too dangerous to go in there. And then the lower right-hand picture shows you what that stand looked like after it burned. Lots of high severity fire effects, lots of potential for erosion, lots of potential for nutrient losses. So there's the watershed effects, and then there's also this recovery piece, and the fire severity and various other factors influence what's going to happen, and we care about that for many reasons. Monty said you don't want to be recreating in forests that don't have trees. It's just not quite so fun, and there's a lot of other things as well from a watershed perspective. Those trees are critical in terms of sucking up nutrients and keeping them on the landscape. Abating the changes in water supply. He mentioned the big erosion event and the downcutting of that river. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the trees were no longer taking up water. Of course, there was erosion that caused it, but there was a loss of cover and a loss of water use. So we're very interested, and we're seeing some things that are somewhat alarming. So on the left-hand side, you see data showing the new trees coming in following fires. These were fires that burned in 2016 and 2018. All gray phase lodgepole pine fires. And you can see the pretty bad regeneration, like pretty much zero for most of those sites until you get to one. That happens to be the Badger Creek fire right along the border. It's now being overrun by the Mullen fire, if you haven't heard about that one. And so there's concern that the lodgepole forest is not coming back like you might have learned about in your undergraduate ecology classes. They like to grow following fires, serotinous cones open up. But if the trees have been dead for 15 or 20 years, the viability of the seeds inside those cones really declines. And at this point, it's probably about 50% of what it was when the trees were killed. We've seen similar things in the Church Park fire, which is a small burn over by Winter Park that happened in 2010 and followed with Tony Chang and people at CSU, followed the regeneration and found virtually no conifer regeneration for over 4 years following the fire. That's an alarm to the forest managers because they have to start thinking about whether they should be replanting. Okay, so the gray phase fire situation, a lot of people call this kind of the new normal. It's not going to be normal. We don't know what we don't really know too much about it. So there's the picture I showed before. There are the burns that have happened in the last few years. Monty's Cameron Peak fire keeps going off the page and we can't keep up with it. The Mullen fire came out of nowhere. That's all classic gray phase. You can see these dwarf the Beaver Creek fire that I mentioned. That's the one that's kind of the lower one on the Colorado border. The Ryan fire is above it. We talked about the Williams Fork fire. That's in the lower side. We're now up to about 300,000 acres or more of gray phase fires this summer. One thing I failed to mention early on, but just for context, during the peak of the beetle outbreak, the beetle was killing double the acreage that these fires were in a year. So that beetle outbreak was a slow fire. It was a big deal. Okay, now one thing I wanted to leave you with, and this is kind of exciting potentially, and the kind of thing that gets into your conversations about wicked problems. So meanwhile, as the rest of us are getting smoked out and dealing with the fog of COVID, folks down on the Pike San Isabel are working with partners down there and trying out some new technologies to see whether or not they can come up with options for managing some of these landscapes. I mentioned before that some of the beetle outbreak was limited in where it could work because of steep ground. There are real common thresholds in terms of what kind of slopes forest operations can happen on. It's usually about 40%. We have a lot of ground in Colorado that's way over 40%. And so people have been looking for options that are both ecologically viable and economically viable. And one of these is going on right now. This is the first time this new technology, it's called tethered logging. Basically, you're attaching a processor to the top of the hill and they basically rappel down, and they have a winch system that helps the machinery move up the hill and cause much less damage to the soil than if you put a bulldozer or a rubber tired skidder on it, because it has this winch assist and a lot of sort of high technology bogey systems that allow the wheels to kind of conform to the landscape. So this is a situation where the forester who set this up, Alex Rudney, is a firefighter and a silviculturalist, and his projections, his objectives were to reduce the crown bulk density, the amount that fire could move through there, and the fuels on the ground. His objectives were very much to treat these gray phase forests. So I wanted to leave you with the idea of considering what are some of the options that will sort of balance the devastating effects of these forest health fires, beetle outbreaks, with kind of our land management options. The picture on the left shows skid trails coming out of this harvested area. We're involved in researching these. That's a potential concern. The Forest Service needs to be sure that there isn't a lot of flow or erosion coming off of these slopes. But there's also the context. How much does that relate to the amount of erosion that comes off of a burned landscape? And kind of keeping those things in mind as we address both the economic and ecological options that we confront. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much. Hopefully you'll take something forward for your conversations. I've put up a couple of papers there and the website and my email address. If you'd like to hear more, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chuck and Monty. That was a tour de force of information. We really appreciate it. I want to offer, just go straight to our our NoCo group and offer you the chance to ask questions. Since we're somewhat limited on time, I want to see what's most important to you to hear further from Chuck and Monty on. And feel free to either use the chat, or I'm okay with you jumping in. If it gets unruly, then I'll make everyone use the chat.
I just wanted to say that one thing that was really telling was the idea that the fire season did I understand that in about the last 30-ish years or so, the fire season has extended by about 30 days?
That's definitely one of the sources that I've seen. There's data all over about it, but usually they look at those in 30-year chunks, but 3 weeks to a month.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing is when it correlates with other large macro data that we see, it starts to kind of self-verify the data. And what I was thinking of was the snowmelt data showed about 13 years ago that the date of snowmelt, the date at which the pack stops increasing and begins to recede each year, according to two different measures. The first measure was a linear projection, a straight line projection off tangent to the curve of the hockey stick of change that was going on, was about a third of a day per year. But if you actually use the curve, it was about a day per year, which would be about a month in 30 years that it's changing. And the one that was actually happening was the curve, of course. They just didn't want to be too aggressive in their predictions as scientists. But what was happening at that moment was a day a year that winter is receding back towards the first of the year in the spring. So it kind of correlates with what we're seeing with the fire season.
Chuck,
yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff right over the hill from you at Fraser, and that earlier flow record is one of the things. We also complain about trying to do snow surveys on April 1st now because that's kind of late. That's what we use. That's the traditional date for doing snow surveys in those areas. But the pack is often already started to recede at that point. Other things that you've probably noticed in Empire, we're getting rain at times of the year we never had before. So rain on snow, which is something that never occurred in Colorado, certainly never occurred at Fraser. That's happening. And that has huge impacts. So when we start to talk about watershed effects of wildfire, one of the first things we say is it's all about the summer rain. We don't care about winters. The snowpack, when it melts off, it's going to be a mellow kind of infiltration, as it always has been, except now maybe if we get rain on snow events following a fire, we might actually see ash and sediment moving out early with the first flow. So that's kind of an interesting situation. Of course, just like with summer rainstorms, it depends on whether you get them or not at that time. And so some years you will, some years you won't. But it used to be a foregone conclusion that wouldn't happen, and now I wouldn't necessarily assume that.
Thanks, Chuck. I've got a couple of questions here, just related to this last discussion. When does the fire season normally end? So what would have normally been the end date in the NoCo area?
Monty probably knows that better than me. I always think about things kind of settling down, but before the end of October or before the 1st of October, but I don't know for a fact and should defer that.
I would say that for a lot of the high country, so kind of getting either on the edge of NoCo or up in our Grand County type of country, September is when stuff really starts to wind down. Typically, we see on a normal year by October, the moisture that we receive, the fuel conditions, everything else, we're kind of shut down by the end of September. We still have opportunities for prescribed fire and things like that throughout October, but it's real, like there's a 2 or 3 day window when what we say fuels are available to burn, and so it works well for prescribed fire, but not for wildfire. This year is completely different, and right now the type of conditions we see on those 3 days here and there in October, that's just our normal low day. And then we're seeing high days that look more like our worst days in August. They're just a little shorter. But last night, for example, we got almost no recovery. So the night cold temperatures and humidity, it didn't do much. The fire actually burned very actively all night last night. And that's not behavior we see except at the end of August and 1st of September. And here we are, the 9th of October.
Thanks, Monty. One last question before we pivot to our next presentation. Megan from Larimer asked Chuck, I didn't quite follow. Can you explain what contributes to when these gray forests post-fire, as with the Hayman fire, transition to shrub and grasslands versus restore to forest?
I'm not sure if I quite followed that. I don't think that the transition is to shrub and grassland is necessarily what's going to happen. So if I gave you that impression, that was incorrect on my part. There's been a transition, basically a slow transition from ponderosa pine at Hayman into kind of that shrubby situation in that photo that I showed. In terms of our lodgepole gray phase forests, we're seeing some of them that are going to regenerate into lodgepole as per usual, some of them that are probably going to be something different, and we don't really know yet. We haven't followed them long enough. The Church Park fire I showed you, there's a lot of aspen coming into that, so there's nothing wrong with aspen. So that may be the way that forest tends to go. It may just be a longer time before it becomes conifer again, but we really don't know. And I would probably not think that it would turn into a shrubland, you know, in some sort of an arrested succession type of perspective. But I think this is what we'll see are new conditions that aren't sort of the lodgepole pine forest that we all grew up thinking about, where you have a very dense, even age stand of pine, and you can associate that with a fire or a harvest, and you say, yeah, that happened back in the 60s or the 50s or the 30s. We may see more open stands. We may see stands that have a different species composition, and we may see some that have more herbaceous or understory or shrubby understory, none of which is necessarily a bad thing, although it just sort of depends on what you want. And in terms of things like retention of nutrients, protection of soil, the sooner we can get the area vegetated, the better.
Thanks, Chuck. I see some great additional questions coming in. I do have to move us along a little bit in the interest of time, but Chuck, those questions are directed towards you, so feel free to use the chat to maybe reply to them quickly here as we make this transition to our next presentation. One's about pine cones not receding as expected, and the other is about the use of thinning operations. So thanks for those questions. Yep. Let's move to our next presentation. Mark Anderson, who's the Director of Science for Eastern US at the Nature Conservancy, is going to give us a very brief overview of the TNC Resilient and Connected Landscapes tool. We don't have the opportunity to do today is take a really deep dive into the tool, but hopefully this overview and really quick demo will also spark interest in digging deeper at a later point if you'd like to learn more and play around with the tool itself. So Mark, we can see your slides, and we welcome you to start your presentation. Thank you for being here. Can't hear you yet, though. You're on mute. Still on mute, Mark. Can you just click that one more time? The unmute button. Mark, we can see the slides just fine. We're just needing you to unmute yourself. Looks like you're unmuted.
How about now? How about
yeah,
now?
All right.
Okay.
Cool, thanks.
Sorry, once I was sharing, then I couldn't get to my mute button. Let's see.
All right, takes over the whole screen.
Okay. Okay, do you see, you can hear me and you see a slide that says Resilient and Connected Landscapes?
Sure do, yeah.
Okay, great. And let me say, before we even start, if any of you want to play with the map tool as we go through this presentation, just type in maps.tnc.org/resilient land, and you can look at it as we go. So thank you. Well, and Chuck, that was an amazing presentation. So that was worth the morning right there. I appreciate the invite and the ability to present to you. What I want to walk through is the nature. So I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm the Director of Science for the Eastern US, but I've been leading the resilience mapping for about a decade. We've been working on this science for about 12 years. And we just released, earlier this week, we just released the whole US resilience map, which has been, it's been quite a week. And we did this in 9 different study regions over that 12-year period. And in each study region, we had a large steering committee. That picture there, you can see a small part of the Rocky Mountain Steering Committee. And it's really that group that's reviewed all the data sets, reviewed all the results and analysis, and kept, you know, whenever we went off track, they kind of got us back on track. So it's really been their work that I think is the reason that we think these tools will be very useful to you. So all thanks to them. I am going to give you just a very high level look. Our motivation really, again, many of you have referred to this already, has been climate change. And what does climate change mean for how we do conservation? Particularly where we work and how we work. A lot of you have referred to this already. We talk about climate change as a threat, but I'm not sure that's exactly the right word, because climate change is a change in the ambient conditions of the planet. And in order to stay, you know, in balance with the ambient conditions, nature itself has to shift and move. There's really no way around that. Because we've changed the temperature and moisture regimes of which define a lot of the systems on the ground. And this really hit home to me a few years ago. This study came out for the East using FIA data, forest inventory and analysis data, looking at trees. I mean, there's been great studies already on birds and mammals and insects and how they're moving, but trees themselves, this study looked at the last 40 years, 86 trees, and they found that in fact our trees have been moving westward and northward at about 10 to 11 miles per decade, you know. And what they've been doing in this map here, the dark blue is moisture, you know, it's been getting moister in the Midwest, and a lot of trees that were kept out of the Midwest by drought or that were kept out of the north by cold have been slowly shifting into that. So obviously trees move, you know, they don't move themselves. It's their offspring that move. Parts of the forest die out in some places and then they regrow in new places. So you get this incredible movement. And a friend of mine, Jenny McGuire, has been looking at pollen samples across all of North America, 23,000 pollen samples, and found that, yeah, things transition. You know, many of our systems transition from forest to shrub, back to forest, back to shrub, into barren land, you know, and those transitions tend to happen every 500 years, and they speed up under climate change. So we're clearly in, you know, clearly we're in a world where things are shifting and transitions are starting. And it's also clear that working only at a single site, you know, you're going to only be able to do so much. We have to start thinking about a network of sites if we really want to retain diversity. And the results of the work that I'll show you now, you know, is really, we've come up with what we think of as a sort of a baseline network of sites that would be needed to sustain diversity while allowing it to move and transition and change, but still try and support all the diversity on the landscape. So I'll walk you through this. It has 3 parts to it, and each of these parts has its own map. And I think it's these maps that will be of interest to you. And you know, you can use them alone or you can use them combined. Hopefully you can work them into your own planning processes, because each of them shows a little bit different part of the landscape. The first part, what we call resilient land, is focused very much on microclimates and connected microclimates that represent all physical environments. The second part is really focused on connectivity and thinking about a permeable landscape. And then the last part is about resilient systems and how we keep resilient systems on the landscape. So the resilient land, there's no climate models in this climate resilience study. We took a different approach by looking at the properties of the land itself. First, we looked at the properties of the land that actually determine the biodiversity patterns we're used to seeing. And you know, these are very obvious in Colorado. The elevation zones, the bedrock geologies, and the different soil types are really critical to how biodiversity lays out on the landscape. And we think it's going to be very important to keep in our conservation to make sure we have conservations on across elevation gradients at different elevation zones and on different soil types if we really want to retain the full diversity of the system. When we get into what makes a site resilient, so our definition of resilient is that the sites will retain biodiversity and ecological functions even as they change. And for that, we really honed in on microclimates. And I think you know, I grew up in Colorado, so I know like microclimates are very intuitive to Colorado folks, not so everywhere in the country, but you know, whenever you've been out walking and you see a slope where you have snow, you know, snow on the north side and it's dry on the south side, or you see moisture where you get shrub development in one aspect, or you find a frost pocket where snow is retained, or a basin that collects water, what you're seeing is climate variability. So most of our species don't actually perceive the regional climate, they perceive a local climate around them. And many of our landscapes actually take climate and divide it, you know, split it up into all sorts of different microclimates that are very relevant to the species around there. And you can have climate variation in some of these 10, 15, even 20 degrees differences, you know, among different aspects on a hot day, or different land position or slopes. And so our work is looking at where are the places that have so much climate variability built into them that we think that climate variability buffers the species from the effects of the regional climate. We created these climate models now for they're microclimate models for the US, and I'll just show you a quick picture for Colorado. What the model does, it takes a landscape like you see here, it maps it out and identifies sort of all the different microclimates available. It's about a 21 unit model. And then it looks for the places that have the most microclimates close together in a 100-acre circle. And here you're seeing a great example of many microclimates on the landscape, from wet, you've actually got wet and moist and dry, flats to slope bases to south-facing slope to exposed ridge. You know, you have a lot of different climatic combinations in the landscape. And this is what the microclimate map looks like for Colorado. And on this map, so on this map, yellow is average, always the center point, and then greens are things that are above average, and brown are below average. And I also want to point out that when we created these maps, we compare the prairies to themselves and the mountains to themselves within these ecoregion lines that you see. You know, if we compared the prairies to the mountains, it would look very different than this map, because the prairies have very few microclimates compared to the mountains. But when you compare them to themselves, you see the river systems and the foothills and some of these other areas, the canyons, popping out as microclimate centers. In the mountains, the microclimates are distributed all over the place, but they're often tracking river systems. And then the second piece to the resilient land, I can check my time here, is making sure that those microclimates are connected and not highly fragmented by human modification. And we spent years on this one too. You know, we collected all the pieces of human modification, from wind turbines, oil and gas pads, power lines, roads, development, industrial agriculture. And we created what we call a resistance grid to see how easy things can move through a landscape that is sort of fragmented by these different elements of resistance. And here again, this is what that connectedness map looks like. Again, the prairies are being compared to themselves and the mountains are being compared to themselves. So when you put those microclimates and connectedness together, you get what we call the resilience map for Colorado. And here's what it looks like. I think I have a zoom in. Oh yeah, here's a zoom in for your area. And again, this is just showing you for the different ecoregions and the different geologies and soils, where are the places with the most connected, the most microclimates in a highly connected landscape. And it really does seem to highlight a number of the riparian and river systems, the Front Range area, some of these little smaller and larger hill complexes. You would know better than I what's being highlighted here. But a lot of resilience in this landscape, probably some of the highest areas of resilience, in the country actually. So it's cool to see. So that's the resilient land part. The second part was to think about movement and connectivity and how, and in this we use the word climate flow to talk about just that gradual movement of populations over time in response to change, those transitional movements. And we use some great technology now called CircuitScape, which is a new tool that can map movement on the landscape as if it was electricity moving across a resistant surface. For those of you who are engineers, if you're an ecologist, you can think of it water moving across a watershed, and you can find the areas where things concentrate. You get a lot of flow concentrating through a small area like you see here in the Appalachians. Or in the West, you'd have a lot of diffuse flow, a lot of movement, but it's all spread out. And we took this technology and we drove it down to a much finer scale than you see here. Here's the fine scale map. And I'll point out on this map now, if you look at Colorado, what we call diffuse flow is in blue. And the darker the blue, the more flow that's going through. So I just wanted you to see, from a national perspective, there's this big northward movement of flow going right through your study area, that very dark blue here. The concentrated flow, that are almost what we call climate corridors are in orange on this map. And you can see a lot of those are really out in the prairie portions of your state. So I have a zoom in, I think here. Yeah. Again, so that northward climate linkage connecting, running from New Mexico up to Wyoming right through this area of the highest flow. It's pretty interesting. But you also see there's a couple big connections going eastward at the top and the south part of your study region, or there's a zoom in. All right, and lastly, the last thing we wanted to do, so you can look at these again separately. You can look at resilient sites with microclimates, the flow areas that are predicted to have the most movement as things change and transition. And then lastly, we wanted to look at places that have been recognized already for their biodiversity value. And the way we did that was we looked at the state wildlife action plans and their conservation opportunity areas. And we also looked at the Nature Conservancy's ecoregional assessments. Both of these tended to identify intact habitats or areas with rare species or sometimes exemplary natural communities. And again, in Colorado, when you look at those maps, this area is highlighted often by both TNC and the SWAP for exemplary biodiversity or recognized biodiversity values. There's a zoom in of the study area. All right, and then finally, what our last, so again, you can look at these things individually, or our final thing was to overlap those three things: site resilience, climate flow, and recognized biodiversity, and see how they lined up on the landscape. And here's the national picture of that. And all you need to know to interpret this map is the dark green has all three. So wherever you see dark green, those are resilient areas that have a lot of climate flow, so they're positioned in the climate flow, and they also have recognized high quality biodiversity now. And those seem to us in the Nature Conservancy the most critical areas to protect if we want to represent and maintain all diversity. Also on this map, the blue areas have a lot of climate flow and they are resilient. So we thought those are critical too, the blue. And then the lighter green has biodiversity and they're resilient, but they're outside of the main flow areas. So they're not quite as well connected to a network that would allow movement. And here's the zoom in for your area. I mean, it's sort of shameful. Your area is just full of this stuff. So, but again, the dark green, resilient areas with high climate flow and has been recognized for their intact biodiversity sort of running through your site. The blue are the focus more on connectivity and resilience. They may have great biodiversity, it just hasn't been recognized by anybody. And then the light green, biodiversity and resilience. Okay, we just added, I'll show you this, I think I'm about out of time, but we just added this last 2 weeks a carbon calculator in here that we hope will be useful, because certainly starting to make the case of multiple values is really important for getting, well, it's important both for our climate and also for promoting the importance of preserving our forests and soils. And I haven't done a carbon calculation, but you can go on the calculator now and you can get estimates of carbon, forest carbon and soil carbon of your area. So I encourage you to do that. I don't know if we have time for a demo, but if all of this information is packed into, do we have a few minutes left?
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah, we'll make it up in the later part of this.
All right, let me see if I can share this. Tell me if you can see the resilient land mapping tool.
Yes.
Yes, oh great. Okay, let me make it full screen. Oh, I can't get my full screen. It's under the, it's under my screen. It's my, oh well. Okay, we've got your area here online. So just quickly to show you some of the things you can do with this. If you're interested in the microclimates and climate resilience, you can go down to the resilient components here. You can look at the geology and soils. You can look at the elevation zones. You can look at the landforms, and then the landform should correspond to the landscape diversity estimates. And you can zoom in, you know, if you want to look at an area and look at microclimate dispersion over that area, you can zoom in really as far as you want on this. And you can look at how connected that is. This area is showing maybe a little town or something here on a highway. You can look, so then you can zoom, you can look at those climate flow areas by clicking on climate flow continuous, which gives you a continuous value. Or you can look at climate flow categorical, which sorts it into diffuse flow or concentrated flow in orange. And you can look at biodiversity value and the resilient and connected network. And let's see if I can demonstrate this if we have a minute or two more. You can bring into this if you're interested in a particular area. I'm just going to sketch one here. Okay, I've just started an analysis of an area. So you could bring in, if there's a place that you're thinking about or an area you're interested in, you can sketch a polygon or bring in a shapefile, and it will give you a bunch of statistics about that area. And I asked it to assess the carbon while it was at it. And so here you can look at the carbon data is in here as organic soil carbon, forest carbon. The forest carbon estimate is from Chris Williams at Clark University. It's a really nice new model they just released. It's been calibrated with FIA data, and it has disturbance regime built into it, but it is for 2010. So it's carbon, 10 years ago. And the soil carbon just came out from Oak Ridge Lab. It uses the Surgo soils and soil samples, and it's also for 2010. Okay, so for the area I just assessed, here you go, you get, so that area has high estimated resilience, 1.2 standard deviations above the mean. It has high local connectedness. It has very high landscape diversity. And you can look at these pie charts and you can see what elevation zones and types of bedrock are in that area. You can see whether the resilient and connected network intersects that area. Here it does. 19% of it is outside of the network, but the rest of that area I drew is in the network. The polygon I drew, by the way, was 89,000 acres, sort of a random polygon, but, and then you can look at and see that that area has 2,600,000 tons of carbon estimated at about 46 tons per acre. And most of that is in the soil. Some of that's in the above ground. Small amount is in coarse woody debris. These are estimated from models. So, and you can get estimates of the soil carbon, and you can look at the NLCD land cover of that polygon that I drew. Again, if you forget it, let me close that. That was the estimate for this area that I drew in. Okay, well, I'll stop. So we're hoping, that this information will be informative as you think out, particularly if you start thinking about a broader conservation plan. Maybe you already have one. I'm sorry, I don't, or how this landscape fits together, or how it will retain diversity, or how it connects to other landscapes in the state. Hopefully some of these data sets will help you with that.
Thanks so much, Mark. And as I said, we'll catch up sometime a little bit on the back half and the small groups. So not worried about that, but also want to let y'all have a break soon. Welcome questions in the chat. Feel free to flip your videos on. And here's a question from Bo at Conservation Colorado. Mark, is there a way to overlay areas designated for conservation, for example, wilderness, roadless, mineral withdrawals, NCAS, etc., NCAs, etc.?
Yes, so great question. They are in the tool. If you zoom in really close, you can turn them on. But if you want to overlay them, there's a place where you can just enter your an HTML of a shape, HTML of that data layer if you have it, and it will overlay on the tool. So it's very easy to do. I'm sorry, Bo, I just closed it, so.
Great, thanks. Other questions? I have one. Well, I guess I'm kind of thinking about the presentation we just had prior from Chuck, and then this presentation. I'm trying to think about how to wrap my mind around the idea that the NoCo region is, you know, dark green in the overlay of all these pieces that suggest resilience and biodiversity and high climate flow. So that all seems really good. And yet we just heard Monty and Chuck talk about how we're just dominated by wildfire this season, and there's these higher risks. So how do you reconcile those two pieces of what this tool tells you about resilience, but then what we also know about, you know, fire regime on the landscape?
Well, I'll start, but that's a good question for Chuck, really. So, and I know fire regime much better in the East now. So, but I would say the areas of high microclimatic diversity are probably, you know, as a fire goes through a landscape, the severity of the fire varies quite a bit spatially on the landscape. And probably the areas where more of the diversity in soils are retained are probably correlated with those areas of high microclimatic diversity. That'd be my guess. And that would probably be true in the East. I don't know, Chuck, does that make sense in the West?
Yeah, I mean, I think there would be some, you know, if you just think about it, it's kind of back to what Corinne was talking about with some of these wetland areas. If you sort of think about fire behavior on a hill slope, and tends to be more severe where you have dry fuels up on the hills, maybe less severe down in some of the lower riparian areas. They certainly burn, and we've seen fires burn through willows and wetlands and beaver areas, but they may be, those high biodiversity areas, those high carbon areas may be less likely to have severe effects. But yeah, that I just put something in the box, Mark. This is a great talk and a really cool tool, and it would be great to sort of see just how small you can go with this kind of stuff, whether you can look at you know, both you know, Surgo data, it can be pretty spotty where you have it and what resolution it is, but if you could overlay that with burn severity, that would be super cool. And, you know, to think about how those things might vary across landscapes, I think that would be a really useful thing. And, you know, it may be the kind of thing you'd have to look for your opportunity to do it because of, you know, where you've got the layers that you could stack up on a fire, where you've got a good soil layer.
All right, I'm going to take one more question from the chat. And again, feel free to keep putting questions in the chat because maybe Chuck and Mark can humor us with responding over break. Holly Norton at History Colorado has made a connection here, I think, between our last core topic and which was on DEI. And she said, there are increasing conversations about understanding indigenous fire and wildfire management in North America prior to European occupation. Are indigenous methods and understandings being incorporated in anyone's work here in Colorado?
Well, I can speak to that. I'm not sure about indigenous fire, but we have on that tool, you'll see the indigenous lands are grayed out. And that was, we are in conversations with the various tribes. It's going to be a long time, really. There's a lot of tribes. So, you know, we're in conversations with them to incorporate some of their ideas of resilience and make sure they understand and have vetted the results on their, you know, on their territories, their sovereign nations, before we release the results. So we're having those conversations right now.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think there's the question of indigenous lands, but also just indigenous management tools. I don't know if there's.
So this is Chuck. I guess I would say that there has been some consideration for that, especially in the Ponderosa Pine areas where people have done detailed fire history and thought about historic burning and trying to recreate some of those patterns, at least to get back to the sort of structure and composition, you know, the clumpy, patchy ideas that people talk about in those lower montane forests that may have been remnants of indigenous burning. That's the example that I can think of.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay, seeing a question here about downscaling patch size limits. I know that Jonathan from Keystone had a question about understanding the legend a little more, but I think those are technical questions we can chat about. But certainly if people want to know how to use the tool, let's keep your questions coming to Mark. And thank you to Monty, Chuck, and Mark this morning. Really fantastic presentations, a lot of things to digest and to think about how NoCo can apply this information. We're going to head into a break and then come back and think more about management and options for public lands. So that'll feature a conversation with Tony Chang at CSU, and then a live conversation with Angela Bogue at DNR.